On the Democratic side, it's settled science. There's no dispute. They think more government intervention is always better, that Soviet central planning is the path to prosperity, and that they must implement, as Thomas Sowell says, the vision of the anointed. But on our side of the aisle, there's a lively, important discussion about the government's role. And I will tell you, good policy, in my mind, is never made in haste. The national mood may change. Basic laws of gravity and economics don't. I think of economics as biology. A lot of my contemporaries think of it as math and physics. It's not. It is a living organism, and we have to be very careful when we adjust the organism. And I think that that is this great discussion that's going on here. Our side can broadly be defined in two camps: traditional free market advocates who want to reduce the government's role and promote international trade. On the other side, a newer generation of conservatives are pushing back against orthodoxy, favoring a more active approach to greater self-sufficiency for the U.S. economy. At the heart of the debate are a range of tools like targeted support for specific types of economic activity and tariffs on imports. I will refer to these policies under the umbrella of industrial policies. In my view, we must take the best insights from different parts of the conservative movement to shape an economy that delivers for the American people and safeguards our national security. The government can't create sustainable jobs or a thriving economy, but a lack of government action can destroy these national treasures. We all have our unique perspectives, and my perspective is multifaceted. I've been a financial market operator for 40 years. I got the gray hair, the wrinkles to show it. I've also owned and continue to own a variety of operating businesses. I may not look like it. I'm one of the largest farmers in North Dakota. Our family's in the hospitality, the publishing, professional sports, real estate, and financial services. I've also been a professor of financial history, having taught courses at Yale on financial cycles, economic crises, and market structure. I was born in rural South Carolina and lived in New York and London. I have 58 passport stamps, but in 2020, I decided there's no place like home, and I decided I wanted to raise my children less than 100 miles from where I was born. I'm a big believer in what Margaret Thatcher said: if you're not from somewhere, you're from nowhere. Those of you familiar with the similar work of Neil Howe, The Fourth Turning, probably nobody in this audience has ever read that book, will know that authors emphasize, that both of them emphasize how the formative experiences influence all your future opinions. My formative experiences began in the 1970s when my family waited in gas lines. My college years and early career saw President Reagan unshackle markets, renewing the promise of the American economy. At the same time, in the 1980s, I saw President Reagan raise the level of the defense spending from 4.5% of GDP to 5.7% of GDP. He was attacked by progressives and by budget hawks. He was going to bankrupt our country. This was a form of industrial policy that won the Cold War. But there were downsides and long-term complexities associated with the defense buildup. As the defense budget normalized in the 1990s, there was a significant economic downturn in California, his home state. 10% at the time, 10% of the Golden State's employment was linked to military spending. President Reagan suffered through that, did the right thing. My personal theory is that this tech-savvy, highly educated cohort has now become Silicon Valley. This example, however, highlights the need to view industrial policy as a tool that is neither inherently good nor bad. It is a tool, not a goal. Instead, we must ask the following questions. What is the nature of the problem? Is a particular industrial policy solution well suited to address the problem? And would it strengthen national security and improve the standard of living of the American people? Stepping back, the reason we are having a debate over industrial policy is the interconnectedness of the United States to the global economy. As U.S. policymakers made the deliberate choice to encourage greater integration with the global economy in recent decades, too often they have failed to appreciate the risk and the downsides, especially for working Americans. The problem is that there are at least two underlying flaws in analogizing domestic free markets to the international economy. The first mistaken assumption is that national borders aren't particularly important, so that splitting production between nation states is not significantly different than splitting it between domestic U.S. states. However, this approach is fundamentally mistaken. Even among countries with deep historical connections and similar economic systems, national borders are and always will be real. We have discovered that critical inputs into the U.S. economy may be unavailable at unexpected moments if we don't generate them ourselves. The second flawed assumption is that other countries' economies operate on the same framework as ours, and that as a result, competition between U.S. workers and businesses and foreign counterparts will be fair and value-enhancing, just like here at home. For example, China deliberately forces down wage costs by transferring resources from the household sector to the manufacturing sector through a range of statist policies. It runs mercantilist currency policies. This wouldn't be possible in the United States because workers, also known as voters, they won't tolerate receiving below market wages. Additionally, the lack of market access and transparency shields Chinese companies from competitive pressures. This is how, during COVID, amid the lack of foreign visitors, the Chinese expanded industrial capacity up the value-added chain without the world taking notice until this past year, highly competitive Chinese exports have started flooding the world. We are focused on their real estate crisis, and they are increasing their exports. Free market economic logic breaks down when market participants don't have the same incentives and constraints. Risk management. Recognizing the fundamental problems that international entanglements pose to the U.S. economy and U.S. workers is the first step. But I'm also guided by my experience applying risk management techniques as an investor and trying to analyze how these problems translate into risk for the U.S. economy. My multi-decade experience has led me to a very simple definition of risk: probability and severity. What's the chance it's going to happen? How bad is it going to be when it happens? As a general principle, concentration is a major risk. If you have an excessively concentrated portfolio, whether it's in investments or trade or your supply chain, and something unexpected happens, you can easily find yourself out of business, and if you aren't able to pivot. The same is true for our economy, except that economies can't be turned quickly. Think of industrial policy in this context as an insurance policy. Going without home insurance is a major risk. Why should we take the same risk with the U.S. economy? Short-termism is another major problem in investing and in corporate behavior in general. Policymakers can also be taken in with the allure of the day rather than engaged in deliberate long-term planning. The short-term optimal solution is often not robust. As we all understand, productivity, not financial engineering, drives long-term growth and higher living standards for Americans. A line of thinking in recent productivity research, and I'm very sympathetic to this line, holds that substantial productivity gains are made by observing, refining, rebooting, and reconfiguring adjacent production facilities. As a result, U.S. productivity has suffered as corporate management separated research and management centers from manufacturing operations in distant overseas locations, all for the sake of short-term profits. Look at what happened to Boeing, one of our most iconic American companies, when the headquarters was moved from the production hub in Washington State, near the largest factory in the world, to Chicago, then to Washington, D.C., to be closer to the client, closer to the money. The production and research fell apart. The loss of research and development and quality control culminated in the company's guilty plea on federal charges this past week. How did management cede market share and reputation to Airbus, a loose conglomerate of European national entities? Was there a time when U.S. officials should have intervened? Might there be a larger loss of production-related process insights when manufacturing transfers overseas? I don't pretend to know the answers. I do know that a discussion is warranted, and I know that the answer differs between industrial products and footwear. Now let's turn to the question of what we should do about these risks. At a high level, we should approach designing industrial policy much in the same way an underwriter would approach insurance. First, you need to ask, what is the risk of loss? What is the risk? What is the loss if the risk is not insured? Then you need to ask, what is the cost to insure against this risk? Insurance is not free, and are there any collateral benefits to the insurance? Then we need to compare the cost and benefits of the insurance policy to the potential loss to determine whether we should proceed. This might seem like a straightforward exercise, but it is anything but that. COVID, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and the Red Sea crisis have sensitized us to the general concept that our reliance on foreign goods and services can create losses. But it is difficult to measure the probability and the severity. It is difficult to know the risk in advance. Other risks are harder to capture. In my experience, the biggest risk is often one that you don't know you're taking. As a result, we should be conservative and humble in taking on risk exposure for the U.S. economy. Some risks are existential and binary and important, meaning if you're exposed and the risk materializes, you can be out of business as a company or as a country. The United States is in a race with China over the next generation of computing and building artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other emerging technologies. This is the kind of situation where if we lose, there may be nothing left to fight over. I also want to emphasize that industrial policy is not just a pure cost. There may be other benefits that we will not know at the beginning when we initiate the policies. U.S. spending on defense and technology has a long history of sparking the private sector rather than crowding it out. Without NASA, there would be no SpaceX. Without DARPA, there would be no Amazon. While industrial policy can undoubtedly contribute to U.S. economic growth, we need to be wary about putting too much stock in its effectiveness and not allow it to pick winners and losers. The lessons of China are instructive. Many wrongly assume China's competitiveness was built by the Chinese government's selection and promotion of specific national champions. In fact, many leading Chinese companies emerged after a brutal, subsidized competition with other would-be national champions. The United States should take this lesson to heart in pursuing our own industrial policy. Industrial policy solutions that rely on changing relative prices at the market level create better outcomes and will tend to be more effective than the programs we have seen from the Biden administration, which requires the government to pick winners and losers. This is why tariffs can be a potent economic policy tool since they operate at the market level. Tariff policy should reflect the realities of the international system, including differentiated risk and behaviors of different countries, potential responses, and the realities of international negotiations. Additionally, tariffs should be telegraphed well in advance, both to provide American business with the ability to plan and to signal our resolve to international counterparties. Only the specter of the loss of U.S. market access can motivate other countries to correct the underlying drivers of unfair competition. When I do media these days, I'm often taken to task on tariffs, and I push back and I say, you know, who loved tariffs? Alexander Hamilton. He used tariffs for revenues for a young country and to protect U.S. industry. And I would add a third reason that we can now see with President Trump. As he said the other night in the debate, he can use tariffs as negotiating leverage because during Trump 1.0, other countries knew that he meant business. So, China has strategically used multilateral economic organizations to its benefit, enabled by democratic weakness and Republican disengagement. Nature may abhor a vacuum, but the Chinese don't. There are real frustrations with these institutions, bloated bureaucracy, and their natural tendency towards anti-Americanism. But I believe that a newly energized, muscular Trump 2.0 attitude towards the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the World Trading Organization, the OECD, and others is critical to advance the aims of Americans. Rather than accept the gradual encroachment of U.S. interest in service of an unelected international community, if we are going to be in these organizations, we should be in it to win it. Things have gotten so bad that yesterday, the editor of the Financial Times called for the WTO to be disbanded or reconfigured. Turning to the future, we need to be particularly attentive to the industrial policy implications around AI, perhaps the most important industrial policy development since the Manhattan Project. It is too soon at present to know the proper way to a responsible AI ecosystem, but it will clearly be a public and a private undertaking. We would be wise to avoid China's approach, which will only allow AI for military and government functions, rather than placing it in the hands of the private economy to innovate. And we must also avoid emulating Europe's regulatory impulses, which will likely result in much excess regulation as to render private sector innovation impossible. Not having a central bank digital currency is an industrial policy. It will spur innovation in the blockchain and promote economic freedom. Not having 5 big banks that control the allocation of credit in the United States, as the rest of the industrial world has, will help us promote a more balanced financial system and a more inclusive financial system. In conclusion, as someone who watched aghast as China's unbridled access to the U.S. markets led to the devastation of the Carolinas textile industries and the surrounding communities, I now marvel at the good, secure, high-paying manufacturing jobs from U.S. and global firms that flow into the Carolinas as a result of favorable labor laws, sensible tax policy, and the innovative use of technical schools for worker training. I am optimistic we will get the formula right, but it's an important reminder, as always, to always approach industrial policy analysis with humility, because the government often serves its own interest with your money. We should always apply an extra layer of scrutiny to new programs. Policymakers should spend equal time pruning and eliminating outdated programs, which is a step the Democratic Party now skips completely. Most importantly, we must ask whether a program or strategy strengthens national security and/or improves the living standards of the American people over the long term. America first, but most of all, Americans first. Thank you.